Welcome to Justice Talks. This is the podcast where we use trauma responsive practices to inform criminal justice reform. My name is Dr. Lori Hall, and today I'm joined by two guests. If y'all want to introduce yourselves.
Sure. I'm Jim Hassan. I'm an officer of the St. Petersburg Police Department, and I also have experience in the U.S. Navy.
I'm Lucy Lewis. I'm a student.
Thank y'all for joining me today. So, today we're going to be talking about accountability and responsibility in policing with regard to trauma responsive practices. So, to get us started, what we mean when we talk about accountability and responsibility. So, accountability is about being answerable for our actions, and responsibility is about ownership of our actions. And why this matters in the context of policing, when we're talking about individuals that have been impacted by trauma, the impact of law enforcement action has widespread implications. The way that law enforcement respond to individuals, the tactics that they're using, the choices that they make impact these individuals on very interpersonal levels. And so I want to talk a little bit about the things that we can do in law enforcement to be able to still do the job that we need to do, maintain safety and security in our communities, and enforce whatever regulations, rules, laws, ordinances, whatever it may be. But ensure that we don't create more harm or re-traumatize individuals. So when we think about accountability, right, should that be something that we even have to be thinking about for law enforcement in terms of being able to be answerable for our actions? Because as we've talked about, there's a lot of complex things that are going on in these interactions, and there might be times where we have the ability to think through and make choices that might not have that much of an impact on individuals. But there are some times where, in the heat of whatever's going on, the choices that you have to make and the way that you respond might lead to adverse outcomes. So can you think about this idea of accountability? Should this be a conversation that we're having with policing with regard to dealing with trauma impacted individuals?
Well, of course. I mean, accountability, you've got to have people that are answerable, right? Because we have the ability to, as law enforcement officers, to remove people's rights, because that's essentially what we do to a certain degree when we arrest somebody, right? We're taking away your right to freedom of movement, right? We're taking away your right to go home. Okay. So we need to make sure that as law enforcement officers, we are doing the right things in that due process when we are doing that. We're proper investigations, we're developing probable cause, all those things just from the base standpoint, right? But then on top of that, like, we've talked about before with uses of force and whatnot, are we using the appropriate level of force for what the individual is presenting to us? Because it goes again back to, we want to respond, not react to people. We need to have guidelines, right? Which is why all departments have general orders, SOPs, standard operating procedures, and training. So, hey, this is how we need to handle these situations. Now, of course, those general orders and those SOPs, they don't cover every single possible scenario, right? And that's where officers have to make decisions based off of what they know, what they're allowed to do from general orders and SOPs, what they've been trained to do, what statute says, what the Constitution says, things like that. And then in making those decisions, we need to make sure they're making the right ones. They're not violating people's rights. They're not hurting people unnecessarily. They're not using force at a higher level than what they should. And by holding officers accountable for when they do the wrong thing, whether it be through, mistake or malcontent, that they are held accountable for those mistakes, and there are processes to make sure that that happens.
So when we think about officers going into interactions, whether it's calls for service or investigations, whatever it may be, is this something that law enforcement are mindful of and thinking about the decisions that they're making?
Well, of course, right? So you've got number one, we want to be professionals. Okay,
Mhm.
law enforcement has not always been the most professional career. We have taken strides to make that happen with better training, more education, things like that. And part of being a professional is having integrity, right?
Mhm.
Doing the right thing even when nobody is watching, right?
Mhm.
And so having integrity, if we can show the community that we have that integrity, then they're more willing to trust us. And it goes back to conversations we've had before about we can't do our job without the community. Well, the community doesn't trust me because they don't trust that I'm going to do the right thing. They're
Mhm.
not going to be as responsive and as helpful to us as law enforcement officers. And so by holding officers accountable for their actions, by showing the community, hey, when an officer does something wrong, and we're able to, it comes to us and we're able to show that the officer did do something wrong, there is consequences to those actions, discipline, everything from, sometimes just simple verbal counseling in an attempt to, re-educate the officer, remedial training, things like that, all the way up to and including the termination of that officer, depending on, the circumstances, the officer's history, different things like that. But by holding us accountable, it like I said, the department shows the trust. So as an officer going into a call, yes, I am aware of needing to be accountable for my actions, but I also want to do the right thing,
Mhm.
and we tell our officers that 9 out of 10 times, if you are working in good faith, which means you're working within your general orders and SOPs, you're working under the color of law, you're doing, you know, everything correct based on, we call it the totality of circumstances that we have at the time.
Mhm.
We're making a decision based off of that. We're acting in good faith. 9 out of 10 times, you're going to be fine. It's when you stop paying attention to those things. It's when you're trying to cut corners. You're allowing your own biases to get in the way that we start doing things wrong. We
Mhm.
start violating general orders or we violate people's rights, things like that. And unfortunately, you do see it in law enforcement, just like, it does happen, unfortunately. And I hope that, we're getting better as a community, in law enforcement in general, of holding those officers accountable, for their actions to show the people that we serve, we are trying to do right by you the
Right.
best that we can. And hopefully, we if we can catch officers that may be doing the wrong things early, some discipline, some remedial training, things like that, turn that officer around, we can show the community that we're doing the right things, we're holding people accountable, and we're also potentially saving an officer that does have potential to become a great officer who might just be making some mistakes.
So you're saying that there are a lot of accountability checks that are already in place to hold officers responsible for when maybe they, make missteps for
Right.
whatever reason those missteps happen.
Correct. I mean, one of the big things that, a lot of agencies are doing is the body cams,
Mm.
you know.
Yeah.
Yes, there was a lot of resistance, for body cams from all different kinds of angles. But
Right.
in the end, what we are finding that it's doing is actually helping us out quite a bit. Not just
Mhm.
for investigations, as far as making sure that we have all the information that we need or whatever else, but also you know from the standpoint of complaints. So when somebody is calling in, they're saying, "Well, the officer did this." It's no more. It's not always just the officer's word versus the citizen's word, right? Now,
Mhm.
well, we've got some body cam, hopefully that can back one or the other up. Now, body
Mhm.
cams aren't on all the time, right? Depending on
Yeah.
the agency, some agencies have body cams run all the time. Some agencies say, well, here are the circumstances in which you will have your body cam running. And
Right.
some agencies say, well, here's a few instances where you have to, but you can run it anytime,
Mhm.
you know? And so there is a little bit of difference in that, and when the body cam might run, but officers are becoming much more aware in situations where, like, what, it's not on right now because I technically don't have to have it on, but maybe I go ahead and
Yeah.
pop that on real quick because things are going not so great,
Right.
right? And
Mhm.
so body cams, and then agencies are putting forth policies where when you have officers that maybe they see something happen that they know shouldn't be happening, and then they don't come forward
Mhm.
and present that to a supervisor and be like, "Hey, I saw this situation occur. I don't think it was right." to give the supervisor a chance to review that situation and determine, okay, was that officer doing something wrong or not,
Yeah.
right?
So you're talking about and tell me if law enforcement use this term or not, or if
Mhm.
this is a public media created term.
Okay.
But you're talking about like the blue curtain of silence. Is
Yes.
this a term that law enforcement use, refer to, engage in, or is this something that the media, the public kind of used and created as a label, and that maybe there's a few instances where some people engage in this?
Hmm. So realistically speaking, I don't think it's an incorrect term.
Okay.
Um, I do think, in particularly in the past, yes, there was the code of silence,
Hmm.
right? Um, a lot of people, I say a lot of people, but I think it's one of the reasons that like the thin blue line flag can have a
Hmm.
negative connotation for some people because for a law enforcement officer, the thin blue line is about us protecting people from, the thin blue line in the center with the black on the top and the bottom, and it's that thin blue line that protects people from chaos and death.
Right.
Right? That's the general idea of the symbol. But when you have bad cops, or you
Mhm.
have people making even not it's not necessarily a bad cop, but an officer that's making bad decisions, who's
Mhm.
making mistakes, but then you have people that are protecting that officer. Now that thin blue line starts to become, well, everybody else is in the black, and then you just got that thin blue line of officers that protect each other, and you've got that blue code of silence.
Mhm.
And I think we're making great inroads at getting rid of that. Because like I said, with
Mhm.
like I was just talking about with policies, where it's like if I find out that you saw something and you didn't say it and you know that it was wrong, you could be facing discipline too,
Right.
because you know that shouldn't be happening. Now,
Right.
it sucks that that departments have had to put in policies like that,
Mhm.
right? But in order to create more accountability and transparency with the community, we throw that in there to shows like, yes, if we have an officer that does something wrong, that officer is going to be held accountable. But also, if we have officers that see that officer do the wrong thing and they try to hide it or cover it up or just don't say anything about it,
Mhm.
they could potentially be held accountable for that as well.
Right. There's a saying, it's not that people do bad things, but it's that good people stay silent.
Right.
That I think is the most challenging thing. And there's a lot of instances that we've heard about in the media and things like that where officers stayed silent or didn't intervene. And I'm thinking about one in particular that I used in a course that I teach, where one officer was kind of in charge, and I don't know if that's necessarily like protocol where you have one officer who's responding and then the others are just that show of force that
Mm,
are there to provide support. But she was making the verbal demands and she was acting in this particular way,
mhm,
and the other officers weren't doing anything. And the public became highly critical of this because the ways that this officer was acting, for example, she jerked the person out of the car and
mhm,
threw them to the ground,
mhm,
and I think like put her knee on her back or something like that. So this isn't necessarily protocol, right? This isn't
right.
engaging in the appropriate use of force, especially from the video. It was a particularly hostile thing, but all of the other officers were quiet. They were not interacting. They
Mhm,
were just witnessing, right? And
mhm,
so I think this officer was, put on administrative leave, and there was an investigation and they determined that she didn't follow protocol and things
mhm,
like that. Um, but the public could not understand why these officers didn't interject,
right.
why they didn't stop it, and how they were being held accountable because and I can't remember what agency this was,
Mhm,
but there were no repercussions or accountability checks
right.
to hold these other officers accountable. And so, how should we? How do we go about doing that?
I mean, the short answer is we should probably look into it, right?
Mhm.
So, I'm not familiar with the particular incident that you're talking about. There are there are some reasons where an officer may not necessarily immediately interject themselves. Like, so if I walk up to a situation and they're already hands on, let's say, like by the time I show up, the physical altercation has already started. I may not know what instigated it, right? Because there are circumstances where that, the physicality of the interaction may be what proper,
Right.
right?
Warranted.
Warranted. Thank you.
Yeah.
So when I initially show up, my instinct will be to help
Right.
because I got an officer in a fight. So we're going to get this person into custody so that we can make things as safe as possible. Then we can have a conversation. Okay, what led up to
Hmm.
this occurring? Now, as a supervisor, of course, I'm going, I would ask that question. Hey, what led to this? Like, what's going on? But as an officer, like if I'm just showing up as an officer, not necessarily as a supervisor, I may not ask that question.
Mm.
I might just help them detain the person, and then I'll step off to the side because outside of that, hopefully not more than a minute
Yeah.
interaction, I don't have much else to do with the rest of the call. So
Hmm.
there might be officers that just showed up afterwards.
Hmm.
Then you have new officers. So if the officer in the physical altercation is a newer officer, or if they're watching the officer um, begin the physical altercation with a subject, and they're newer, or they may be staring, going, is this right? Is she doing it? Because she's a senior officer, so she must know what she's doing,
Hmm.
right?
Yeah.
So you have those individuals. Now, the individuals that might have the same level of seniority or even more seniority that are on scene, that has saw the entire interaction, that knew based on what was happening that what she was doing was not correct, they should have stepped in, right?
Hmm.
And so, like I said, I don't know that particular situation. I don't know what the law enforcement agency was. So obviously, I don't know what their policy
Right.
is. I think in general, something like that happens when you have a whole group of officers watching. It comes down to the agency to investigate it, right?
Hmm.
So we would, the complaint would be made, the video would be initially watched, um, depending on, we call internal affairs would do their
Hmm.
investigation, and in theory they would talk to each one of those officers to get their mindset, what was going on, when did they arrive, what was their involvement, and that kind of thing. And then you would go on from there to decide, okay, should these other officers be held accountable for not intervening in the
Hmm.
situation? Did they even know that they needed to intervene?
Right.
Right. And again, it all depends on their
Yeah.
wherewithal. It
Yeah.
doesn't, even the younger officers, they see something, they're like, I don't know that this is above board, but should they have still acted because they were questioning it? That's a question too. So
Hmm.
again, without just having seen the video and knowing obviously all the details, I can't say for sure
Right.
which direction it should have gone. But I've had instances where I've been on a call and an officer seemed to be kind of escalating the situation, and I've had to tap him on the shoulder. Hey, why don't you step aside? You know, or I've, kind of put my hand on their back and stepped in front of them and kind of just taken over,
Hmm.
trying to calm things down. Um, so there is a certain amount that becomes incumbent upon those around when they see a situation starting to get out of hand to say something. But when you've got younger officers and it's a senior officer doing it, it's not so much that blue curtain of silence that they're worried about. They're probably not even thinking about anything like that. They're questioning, am I able to step in? If I step in, am I doing the right thing?
Right.
And some of that
Yeah.
comes down to, but especially if you've got other senior officers that are also there and they're just watching it happen.
Yeah.
My other question is if she's going hands on with a subject, what were the other officers doing?
Yeah.
Because like I said, for me, if I walk up and I've got one officer going hands on with a subject, I'm going to step in and assist,
Hmm.
regardless, because I may not know how it started, but I do know that I got an officer in a physical altercation. So let's get him into custody, get things safe, and then we'll figure it out from there.
You bring up a really important point that I want to talk about. And you said, I don't know what their policy is. And I think that that's extremely important detail to contextualize all of policing, because I think that as a general public, we think that there is one policy
Right.
Mhm.
across all agencies,
Mhm.
right? And so in thinking about the example that I gave, and you said, well, I don't know what their policy is, right?
Mhm.
In those moments, those other officers are balancing a lot of things,
Mhm.
right? They're balancing, chain of command. They're balancing, the policies that the department has, and then they're also balancing their own morals,
Mhm.
right? And so whether or not to step in from an outsider, we could say, "Oh, yes, you should have stepped in, you should have done this."
Mhm.
But that officer is going, "Well, my policy doesn't say that
Right.
I should do this. And if I violate policy, well, I could lose my job."
Mhm.
Right. Or there's a chain of command. This is a senior ranking officer. And what are the implications if I, tap them on the shoulder and say, "I
Mhm.
got this," right?
Right.
Um, because I think that that's an interesting dynamic where, you mentioned like, "Oh, I can tap them on the shoulder and say, 'Hey, let me handle this.'"
Mhm.
And from me, if somebody was to do that, I would probably be like, what did I do wrong? Why
Mhm.
why like I'm being disciplined. I'm
Mhm.
being reprimanded, right? And so that's challenging for officers also
Mhm.
because you're having to manage that dynamic also, right? And then what if this individual is doing something wrong and you do step in and then you violate kind of this brotherhood, right? But I think importantly is there are policies that you have to follow, and those policies kind of trump a lot of other things that are at play in that dynamic, in that you could lose your livelihood
Mhm.
if you violate that policy. But it also highlights in those instances where those officers were not held accountable or responsible for anything, right?
Mhm.
And we hear that, oh, there was an internal investigation done, and the officers did not violate policy or procedures, and
Mhm.
therefore there are no actions, right? And the
Mhm.
public gets enraged by this
Right.
because they seem to they get confused, right? We're
Right.
talking about policy,
Mhm.
right? If you want the moral police to come on and do an investigation, that might have a different outcome,
Right.
right? But at the end of the day, we're talking about whether or not these officers followed policy. And if they followed policy and the community is upset about that, the community needs to be more involved and outspoken about maybe helping to guide what the policies should be. What do we want our officers to do?
Like we have citizen review committees and things like that that are designed to kind of go over policy. There's a group of volunteers that will go over the policy and they'll make suggestions. Like, hey, maybe, this policy, you know, doesn't read well, or, hey, we think you guys should add this or take this out or whatever the case may be. Um, so we're trying to implement, things like that to get that feedback from the community to
Mhm.
write better policies, because you can't be all encompassing, but you want to try to create a policy in such a way that should a situation that we didn't think about happen, there's a way to apply. Does that
Mhm.
make sense?
Yeah.
But, you know, like you said, not every department has the same exact policies. Now, what we do have, for example, in the state of Florida, you have CFA, which the exact acronyms, it's escaping me now, but it's developed by the FDLE,
Mhm.
and it's a standardization. It's good accreditation, right? And the department's been accredited for decades, both through CFA, which is the state, and then there's another one called CALIA, which is a national, actually becoming an international accreditation, and they're actually private. I know the St. Petersburg Police Department, for example, has both the CALIA and the CFA, and it creates standards, right?
Mhm.
Best practices kind of thing, so that when we're writing our policies, they help guide
Right.
our policies and procedures in order to create, again, the best practices within the department. But even with that standard, a policy can look very different from one
Mhm.
agency to another, depending on that
Mhm.
agency's needs, that agency's resources.
Mhm.
That comes into play, and even the agency's community or perception within their own community can
Mhm.
affect how they write their policies.
Yeah.
So, it's that's where it does become difficult, judging any one situation without all the facts becomes very difficult. I know we do that a lot, I think in our society, where something hits the news
Mhm.
and we watch one 30-second bit of body cam, and everybody all of a sudden is a law enforcement expert, and they say, yep,
Right.
this is what should have happened, this is what needs to happen, this is what should happen next. It's like,
Absolutely.
And then, 2-3 weeks later, the rest of the video comes out or additional information comes out, and it's like, oh, well, I
Nobody
guess
steps up to say I was wrong.
no, so, and I mean, that is what it is. Like, you're always going to have those, those situations, but, you know, we do try, I think, as a community,
Mhm.
of professionals, develop that best practice and that best policy. And, that whole curtain of silence thing, in my experience is if it's not completely gone, it's going away.
Yeah.
Because at the end of the day, nobody hates a bad cop more than a good one.
Right.
Because as a bad cop, you make my job so much more difficult.
hmm And then people use that to paint all cops with the same brush.
And that's what I mean.
Yeah.
I've had situations. I've walked up to somebody and they'd be like, "Bro, I don't like cops. You guys did this, and that to me years ago." And best I can say is, "Hey, look, I'm sorry for your past experiences. I can't speak to that. All I can tell you is I'm not that cop.
hmm
And if you just talk to me, maybe we can figure things out.
Right.
And
Yeah.
so try to kind of mitigate some of that."
And I think important for the public to remember is that policy drives action.
Hmm.
So the things that law enforcement are doing are not these individual officers deciding that this is what they're going to do in
Hmm.
these interactions, but rather their behavior is guided by the choices that they're given through policy.
And I like the way that you put it there is their choices are guided,
Mhm.
right? Because again, policy can't cover every single possible scenario.
Right.
And so the general orders or guidelines, I mean, there are
Mhm.
some that are very specific, like, you know, um, you know,
No chokeholds.
no chokeholds. Thank you. Excellent.
Yeah.
No, you will not do a chokehold. Okay. Yep. No chokeholds,
Right. There's never a situation that allows for it.
except deadly force, because some policies that's how they're worded.
Mhm.
Because you also have to be careful not to completely eliminate a choice
Yeah.
for an officer, because there may be an instance, like a lot of departments say, you will not fire from a moving vehicle.
Mhm.
And I think that's, I don't know that that's standard across the board, but I know that's a pretty standard kind of policy. If you're driving a car, you're not shooting out the window.
Right.
But say you're driving and then somebody comes up and starts shooting at you.
Right. We
Like,
can't exclude all options.
right, I mean, yeah, okay, I could slam on the brakes and hopefully they'll go by, but they're still actively shooting at me and I need to get them to stop shooting at me. And the best way to get somebody to stop shooting at you is to shoot back.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, you know, um, and that's even from a military perspective. One of the things they teach for counter ambush tactics is fire back.
Mhm.
Like, that's the first thing you should do, because the ambusher is not expecting you to respond. They're expecting you to immediately defeat you before you have a chance to do anything.
Mhm.
So anyway, but kind of getting on a tangent there, but you do have to be careful with that. But you also have to have policy that says things like, a chokehold is not a general use of force thing that we use, and no, you will not use a chokehold because they can have bad repercussions. Unfortunately, a few years ago, we had an example.
Policy, is an important factor in the way that law enforcement are responding to these interactions. So to ensure that law enforcement are able to do their jobs,
Hmm.
right? Ensuring the safety of the community and the individuals, enforcing law, um, identifying individuals who violate the law, all of those things. What are some ways that we can still ensure that they're doing that while reducing like levels of harm?
I mean, a lot of it comes to training, de-escalation training in particular. I think that's what a lot of the stuff comes down to for us, is just learning how to de-escalate people. A good piece of that, it becomes part of experience. Um, Learning how to bring somebody from an 8 down to a 3 or a 2 so that you can actually talk to them. It's taking care of yourself so that you're not coming to work. And again, I think we talked about that before. When we're talking about trauma informed things, the perspective from the officer's side, what is going on in their
Mhm.
mind, what's going on in the background for them that's causing them to act a certain way. Are they not taking care of themselves? So we need to make sure our officers are taking care of ourselves. We need to try to, I think, implement programs and things to move that forward. We need to offer training, in different ways for officers to take care of themselves and officers to better understand the impacts of trauma.
Mhm.
There's a lot of training that officers have to go through in general. There's yearly training, they got the academy, obviously, we've got post academy training, field training, is several weeks long. But then we also have yearly training that we do every year. So in addition to that, we have advanced training, which is generally more of a at will. That's
Mhm.
the stuff that, hey, I want to take that training, and then I can get approved based on some staffing and things like that. And so, but it's the department providing that training, and then supporting even outside training. So, for example, St. Petersburg College developed a law enforcement mental health certificate that I was a part of last year. The second class is going on now. They'll probably be graduating here in a couple of months. And the idea was to help officers better understand mental health counseling and how it can help us, and how and to hopefully develop maybe one day more culturally intelligent mental health counselors to better help our officers. And so we want them to take care of themselves so that they're making good decisions out on the street, and then we want to provide them with the training to best handle these individuals, and then we want to create policy that best guides their actions, but then also shows them, if you do this wrong thing, you will be held accountable.
Mhm.
Like, you can't put your hands on somebody unless you got a reason to do it,
Mhm.
right?
Mhm.
You can't talk a certain way. You can't go walk up to somebody and start cussing them out, right? Like, it's
Right.
just,
Yeah.
it's rude,
Mm.
it's unprofessional, and it's unnecessary.
Mhm.
Are there times where it might be necessary? Maybe. I don't want to make blanket statements on it, like, again, said on every scenario, but you know, um, yeah, training, taking care of the officers, and making sure they're provided resources to do that.
Do you think that it should be the responsibility of law enforcement to be trauma aware, trauma responsive?
Yes, and like I said, I think, like in Pinellas County, they have the crisis intervention team, which I think I've
Mhm.
mentioned before, um, which tries to do that, tries to make us more aware of, give officers the ability to better understand mental health issues, so that so when they're approaching somebody, I've had a lot of officers tell me from all different agencies that, they've taken CIT, and they've approached like mental health calls. We call them like mental persons or mental violent, right? They approach them differently than they did before, because they
Mhm.
have a better understanding of what that person might be going through, and how that mental health problem that they're having is coloring their perspective,
Mhm.
right? And hopefully it teaches the officer that your own stuff going on in the background also colors your perspective on a situation. We have, just like, talk about bias based policing, or anti-bias training and things like that.
Mhm.
It's not so much necessarily to get rid of bias, it's to help us understand that we have biases,
Right.
just from experience, from growing up, and we need to recognize those, so that when we're, trying to interact with different individuals, we're not allowing some bias from when we were 14 years old to color our interaction with this person.
Right. Yeah, and I think that's a really good point that you're making, is that the experiences that officers have had also shape interactions as well. With regard to accountability and responsibility, law enforcement as an occupation is a very traumatic thing. Um, Going in day to day, witnessing some of the worst things, um, it no doubt has an impact on officer well-being. And I know that you've mentioned, a lot that officer well-being is extremely important, especially when we want to ensure that we don't create more harm. What about when officers maybe don't respond in the way that they should in a particular situation?
Mhm.
And maybe they were triggered. Maybe they're
Hmm.
dealing with their own mental health challenges.
Right.
How can we go about, because a lot of people want to say when people act in incorrect ways or
Hmm.
inappropriate ways, cancel them. They're done.
Right.
Fire them, get rid of them. We don't need them.
Hmm.
But I think that trauma responsive practices is a two-sided coin.
Okay.
It should not just be about ensuring that law enforcement are accountable and responsible for the way that their actions impact the individuals that they interact with,
Hmm.
but also that we are responsive to law enforcement needs because of vicarious trauma, because of their own individual trauma,
Hmm.
and their experiences. So I kind of want to get your thoughts on what are better ways of responding to inappropriate action or action that maybe goes against policy for law enforcement officers, that while it maybe still holds them accountable and
Hmm.
responsible, is more informed, more trauma informed.
Some of that might come down to leadership. So we need to hold people accountable when they make mistakes, right? We're all adults. We're professionals who have the ability to arrest you, put you in jail, um, who theoretically may come upon a situation where I have to point and shoot a gun at you, right? And so we have a lot of responsibility in that we need to uphold a certain standard.
Mhm.
So we've got to hold people accountable. I think when we come across an officer who is not doing the proper things, they need to be held accountable. If there's discipline attached to it, then it is what it is. But then maybe step aside, pull them aside and be like, okay, why are we here? What is going on that we've gotten to this point? Like I said, I've been on calls where I've tapped this officer on the shoulder and be like, hey man, I got this. You're good. Back off. I've had instances where I have, you know, pulled my own officers aside because I've been noticing on calls maybe they're a little more agitated than normal. Now I can't be there all the time. I can't see every single interaction that my officers have, but I have to try, especially when it comes down to, hey, we're in a situation where I have to discipline an officer. Is it just a retraining issue or is there something else going on? Um, and so it becomes incumbent upon us, especially first line supervisors, not to mention, going up the chain, to have that awareness to help these officers out. I mean, maybe they just made a mistake. They just had a particular bad day, traffic was bad, and so, they talked to somebody a little bit untoward where they shouldn't have, you know, or, they're tired, overtired because of a bad schedule. They're not sleeping well, and so they get into an accident, right? Again, they need to be held accountable, but let's talk to them and figure it out. It's like, oh, sorry, I'm sorry, Sarge. I just haven't been sleeping well. All right, well, why aren't you sleeping well? Like, what's going on? Is it just because of this? Is it just the schedule in general? Because, like I said, I work midnights. It sucks. It's hard to sleep sometimes. So I do what I can throughout the day to try to get that rest that I need so that when I go to work, I'm as fresh as I can be. Not every time an officer violates a policy is it because of trauma or mental health issues or because sometimes they just make mistakes.
Mm.
And if that's the case, like I said, you catch the consequences, you get the discipline. Hopefully there's some retraining, remedial training that we can do for you. Or maybe it's a stern talking to. Hey, you know, get your head right and stop making stupid mistakes. Here's the policy. Make sure you read back through it and know it. But there's going to be other times you're going to have to pull them aside. What's going on? It's like, well, my kid is sick. And so I can't get that out of my head because we don't know, what we're going to do as far as this treatment or that treatment, or, hey, I'm going through a divorce and, my, my, my family's not being super supportive of me right now, or, you know, um, I'm going through my own medical issues. Now it's affecting how I'm thinking. It's all right. Well, why don't we talk about getting you involved with EAP, employee assistance program, get you talking to somebody. Why don't we get you, get you to, when maybe you need to go see a doctor. Like, I can't get into your medical history and everything, but let's figure this out and try to work with them. Again, as a community, we're trying to make those inroads, getting better EAP set up, getting different programs like the law enforcement mental health certificate, so that we have groups of officers that have a better at a minimum have a better understanding of mental health, and um, how we can help officers with mental health, and how counseling works, so that we can, because you have still a lot of resistance to that too. Officers like, I don't want to go talk to no shrink.
Yeah.
I'm the person that comes and helps. I don't need help, right?
Right.
We got to get rid of that stigma, and so we're developing these programs, and thankfully, I think we're having a generation that's coming up that's a little bit more open to mental health and therapy and things like that. So I do think that we're starting to get rid of some of that stigma, but there's a certain amount of it that's still there. But we need to take care of our people.
Yeah.
It's like, yes, they need to be held accountable when they make mistakes, when they do things wrong, and sometimes, unfortunately, they make that really bad mistake, and there ain't much we can do for you.
Right.
You know, yeah, if termination's what it calls for, then it is what it is. Hopefully they have some kind of support system, maybe, is there a way for the department to help? I mean, maybe we could offer them, hey, look, if you're having a difficult time with this, here's some referrals to some people that you can go talk to, but you screwed up and you got to go.
Right. Are there a lot of conversations happening within law enforcement to raise awareness about their own trauma, whether that's individual that they've experienced in their personal lives, or is, vicarious trauma? Are those conversations being had among officers to help y'all to be more aware?
Yes. I know in the academy, I believe they're starting to add like a block of training that involves, mental health awareness and trauma awareness. Just kind of explaining to officers like, look, you're going to experience some trauma here. There are going to be some things that happen here that are going to mess you up. There are going to be things you're going to see that are going to stick with you. I think within the ranks themselves, there are also casual conversations. I mean, if you have a squad that's particularly close, they talk about everything, right? Because you're on the street, they become like a second family, right? Because these are individuals that you've helped out in fights. These are individuals that you may have been in a situation where guns had to be drawn, and you've had to rely on this person, for your life. There's always that perspective that you and I can go to a call tomorrow, and God forbid that might be our last call, right? So there's a certain amount of camaraderie that can be built, and some squads are better at it, I think, than others. And so they have the conversations. They're more willing to talk to each other about those things because they're so close. As a profession, we're getting better about that conversation. I do think that maybe there could be some more inroads to that. I know some departments have like wellness officers, so to speak, that are kind of there to help officers through different things and kind of guide them where they need to go. We go through yearly training, again, where we have videos that we watch that talk about trauma and the things that we go through, and here are the resources and things. And so I think the conversations are starting. I would like to see maybe some more empathy training on the supervisory level, just as far as trying to help supervisors learn how to recognize some of those cues, some of those red flags, hopefully before that officer does something stupid, for lack of a better word. Because again, most policy violations are mistakes, either through ignorance or they just get caught up in the moment or whatever else. Nobody goes to work thinking, I'm going to violate that policy today.
I know. I entertain that idea all of the time. I think that's That's a an argument can be made in a lot of situations. Most people are good, well-intentioned humans, and they're not going in looking to break rules, hurt people, and all of these things. And so I like that you point that out. Um, I was going to ask you, what is the thing that you think that the public need to know about law enforcement to help reduce harm?
I would love for everybody. I hope it's okay to like plug somebody else's book, but Lieutenant Colonel Dave Grossman wrote a book called On Combat,
Mhm.
and it's actually it's one of the top books in the reading list for the Marine Commandant, and it talks about all of those things that an officer can expect, and not just officers, but military personnel, anybody that could go into a potentially life-threatening situation, all the things that they can expect to experience, from the physiological to the mental. And it can really, I think, show, number one, it can help those of us that are in the professions to better understand how our own body is going to react to something, that the things that we're going through afterwards are 110% normal, that we're not weird, we're not weak, we're not frail. Like, almost everybody goes through this thing. Things like, during a deadly force situation, you might get what's called auditory exclusion, where I don't hear anything except for like what's right in front of me, or I may not hear anything at all. I've talked to officers that said I couldn't even hear my own gun going off.
Right.
Right. You get what's, tunnel vision,
Mhm.
and all I can see, like literally all I'd be able to see is my threat. I would not, like, right now I can see the two of you sitting next to me by just looking forward. But if I was dealing with a life or death situation directly in front of me, I can't see you, either of you. We got a couple other people in the room that are just past the lights that I can see them right now. But if I'm dealing with this threat that's like right in front of me, I might not even be able to see them. It might be important for the community to understand those types of things, to better understand what is going through an officer's mind in the moment, right? Because they go back and they watch the video and they're like, oh, well, what about this and this and this and this that happened that the officer didn't see? Maybe that would have changed the way he responded. You're right. Maybe it did, but he or she didn't see it,
Mhm.
because all they can hear is this and all they can see is that,
Right.
right? Now there is training that we go through to try to help mitigate that to a certain degree. We try to create training scenarios that are as close to real life as we can, to try to, we call it manufactured stress, right? And try to mimic some of those things that might happen to an officer during a real life situation, so that when it does happen to them, number one, it doesn't surprise them. But number two, they can kind of fight through it a little bit. They can learn how to break that tunnel vision by, doing a quick glance around, kind of break that away. Um, but if you read books like On Combat that kind of explain that, maybe the community can kind of better understand, like in those use of force type situations where an officer did something, it's like, well, was it really necessary? And it's like, well, for that officer in that moment, based on the information that that officer had, yes.
Mhm.
Was it 110% maybe the best option? Maybe not. Does it necessarily make it the wrong, or does it make it a policy violation? Probably not. It just, it's just there's a lot going on in the moment when your adrenaline starts pumping, those cortisol levels,
Right.
jump up. So, and then I think I've mentioned before with the Citizens Academy,
Mhm.
right? Going through things like that, really engaging with law enforcement. So, there's a couple reporters that I've seen that have talked about, they have, might have a very negative view of law enforcement and use of force interactions, but then they go through something like the Citizens Academy. They come out and be like, I had no idea. I thought I knew. I did not know.
Right.
You know, so just, but we try to create those situations where the community can engage with us at those different levels. And I just hope that as we move forward, the community can become more willing to engage in those things, even if it's, like I said, something as simple as reading a book like, a book like On Combat, just to better understand, okay, when an officer is going through a use of force situation, here are all the myriad of things
Right.
that are
Yeah.
happening in their mind and their body and everything else. And again, if they violate a policy, they violate a policy. And this is not to excuse any type of, any type of inappropriate behavior, but to at least better understand that it's not as simple as it might seem on a body cam.
I agree.
Context clues. People, I
Yeah.
feel like the public don't really they don't take in everything. They see what they see and they just kind of ignore everything else to fit what they think is accountability.
Yeah.
I feel like the public has a very high standard, raises officers to a very high standard of accountability that sometimes is a little unreachable. I don't know
Or
how to word
unrealistic. Right?
unrealistic.
Yeah, because these are humans.
Yes, exactly.
And you mentioned you do some types of training to combat the tunnel vision or the auditory exclusion. But at the end of the day, you're not robots.
Correct.
You're humans, right? And we can train and train and train and educate and educate and educate, but we cannot ever not be human.
True.
And that is I think the biggest thing that we all need to learn about law enforcement is they're not robots.
Mm-hmm.
They're humans. And while we do have accountability checks and we do hope that we can hold people responsible for their actions, at the end of the day, there's a lot of mitigating factors that go into this profession.
And touching on the responsibility, some of it does become incumbent upon the officers themselves. Again, taking care of themselves, getting some of the advanced training, right? Because the police departments in general, they train us as much as they can based on staffing, based on funding. I would love, if, we had regular defensive tactics training, regular firearms training, regular de-escalation training on a near, say monthly basis, right? But the reality is we don't have the time, funding, personnel to do that, right? It's just not realistic. A lot of I talk to some folks that compare us to, say, like special operations in the military, right?
Yeah.
It's like, well, SEALs don't even deploy for the first time until they're almost 3 years into their career.
Mm-hmm.
Like they do nothing but train. They're not responding to calls. They're not, SEALs, they train and train and train and train and train, and then they'll go on a, say, 6 to 9 month deployment, and they do that mission for 6 to 9 months that they just trained a whole year for.
Mm-hmm.
Then they go back to the States, they get some decompression time, then they start training for the next mission.
Mm-hmm.
Right? And we're talking months and months, probably years. And then they're pulled away from it for months. And now they're back into a training and administrative scenario. Well, you got a police officer. I'm going to get about, 5, 6 months of training. Then I'm going to be put out into a car with a field training officer for about 14 to 20 weeks. Then I'm going to go solo. And after that first few months, now I am by myself dealing with a mental subject who is schizophrenic, high on cocaine, naked, and really angry.
Yeah.
And he's got a history of fighting with police. And once I'm done with that call, and that guy has fought me, and I got to go wash my hands because he was all sweaty, and we've, either Baker acted him, arrested him, or whatever the case may be. Now I'm 10-8 copy. 10-8 back on the call, waiting for the next one. Right?
Yeah.
And maybe the next one is that baby death.
Yeah.
Then I'm going to handle that for 4 or 5 or 6 hours, and then my shift might have to be over. So now I got to go handle the next call. And so, it's law enforcement is a 24/7 need. So we don't, so we pull officers as we can, we get them the training, and a lot of them do try, a lot of them find their niche, that thing they like to do. You got officers that they love doing traffic for whatever reason. I don't care for it, but hey, you do you, right? So they go and they get laser and speed certified. They get, they take DUI classes on how to do better DUI investigations and FSTs and breath analyze, BTT. It's the breath machine. They get certified on that. You got officers that they become traffic homicide investigators. You know, they do is they go to really, really bad accidents and they basically reconstruct how it happened. And, you know, but they're taking the initiative to put in for and obtain that additional training,
Right.
to make them better at their jobs. But also, you know, like we've got there's classes out there. There's one that the whole class is actually how to handle stress, but it's an elective course. I've got to put in for it.
Right.
So then I got to hope, is staffing going to be good that week? Do I have anything going on in the family that's going to prevent me from changing my schedule to do it? Right. So, you know, there's a lot of factors to go into that too.
Yeah.
And then again, going back once more, taking care of ourselves on the outside.
Yeah. So accountability and responsibility, it occurs on a lot of levels,
Right.
right? So the individual, with leadership, with the community, and so we in law enforcement are taking steps to ensure that we hold officers accountable and that somebody speaks to what's going on.
Right.
Well, thank y'all for joining me today. This is Justice Talks. This is the podcast where we use trauma responsive practices to inform criminal justice reform.